In 1961, Stanley Milgram placed an ad in a New Haven newspaper offering $4 to participate in a study of memory and learning. What participants actually encountered was one of the most disturbing demonstrations in the history of science. How ordinary people, under authority pressure, would administer what they believed to be potentially lethal electric shocks to a stranger. 65% administered the maximum 450-volt shock. Conformity is the tendency to change one's behavior, beliefs, or perceptions to align with group norms. Social psychologists distinguish two types of conformity based on the underlying motive. Normative conformity is driven by the desire to gain approval and avoid rejection. You comply publicly while possibly disagreeing privately. Informational conformity occurs when you genuinely update your beliefs based on the group, concluding that the group probably knows something you do not. Understanding which type is operating has significant implications for whether the conformity is adaptive or problematic. Solomon Asch's classic conformity study placed a naive participant in a group of Confederates who unanimously gave an obviously wrong answer when comparing line lengths. The correct answer was unambiguous. The lines differed by several inches. Yet 75% of participants conformed at least once, and the average participant conformed on about one-third of the trials. In private control conditions with no Confederates, error rates dropped to less than 1%. The mere presence of a unanimous group was enough to make people publicly deny what their eyes were plainly telling them. Asch's subsequent research systematically varied factors to identify what makes conformity more or less likely. Conformity increases with group size up to about 3 to 5 members, after which additional members add little additional pressure, suggesting that it is unanimity rather than sheer numbers that matters. Breaking the unanimity dramatically reduces conformity. Even one dissenter who gives the correct answer reduces conformity from 35% to just 8%, regardless of whether the dissenter agrees with the participant's own judgment. Public responses show more conformity than private ones, and higher status group members exert more pressure. Milgram's obedience study remains the most replicated and discussed experiment in social psychology. Participants played the role of teacher, administering what they believed were electric shocks to a learner in an adjacent room each time the learner answered incorrectly. The shocks were labeled from 15 volts to 450 volts, with the highest labeled with an ominous XXX. As the shocks increased, the learner, actually a Confederate, protested, demanded to be released, and eventually fell silent. An experimenter in a lab coat instructed participants to continue. 65% obeyed all the way to the maximum voltage. Milgram systematically varied conditions to identify what increases and decreases obedience. Obedience dropped substantially when the victim was in the same room, and especially when participants had to press the victim's hand onto a shock plate. When the authority figure gave instructions by phone rather than in person, obedience dropped from 65 to 21%. When two Confederate participants refused to continue, obedience in the naive participant dropped to only 10%. Physical proximity to the victim and psychological distance from the authority figure both reduce obedience significantly. Milgram proposed agentic state theory to explain obedience. When people perceive themselves as acting on behalf of a legitimate authority, they shift from autonomous mode, where they feel personally responsible for their actions, to agentic mode, where they see themselves as instruments of the authority's will. In the agentic state, individuals feel their moral responsibility is transferred to the authority rather than residing with themselves. This helps explain why ordinary, morally normal people can participate in atrocities while following orders. They genuinely experience reduced personal agency and responsibility. The foot-in-the-door technique exploits the psychology of self-consistency. Get someone to comply with a small initial request, and they become more likely to comply with a larger subsequent request. Friedman and Fraser's classic study asked homeowners to place a small sign in their yard supporting safe driving. 2 weeks later, the same homeowners were asked to allow a large, ugly billboard on their property. Those who had agreed to the small sign complied with the billboard at over 50%, compared to less than 20% of those asked for the billboard alone. The mechanism is self-perception. Having agreed once, people see themselves as the kind of person who supports the cause. The door-in-the-face technique works through the principle of reciprocal concessions. Start with an outrageously large request that will almost certainly be refused. Then, when the person refuses, make a concession to a smaller but still significant request, the one you actually wanted. The person, observing that you have made a concession, feels social pressure to reciprocate with their own concession by agreeing to the smaller request. Cialdini demonstrated that compliance with the smaller request was much higher when it followed the large request than when it was made cold. Philip Zimbardo's 1971 Stanford prison experiment assigned college students randomly to be either prisoners or guards in a simulated prison environment. The study was planned to last 2 weeks, but was terminated after 6 days because guard behavior became abusive and prisoner behavior became submissive and depressed at alarming rates. Zimbardo argued this demonstrated the power of situational roles to overwhelm individual character. The study has since been extensively criticized for methodological problems and ethical violations, but its central lesson about the power of social roles and situations continues to be influential. The most unsettling conclusion from decades of social psychology is that evil is often not a function of evil people. It is a function of evil situations. Asch, Milgram, and Zimbardo all demonstrated that ordinary, decent people will do extraordinary, indecent things under the right contextual pressures. Understanding these pressures is not an excuse for harmful behavior. It is essential knowledge for resisting it.